A part of my next portfolio piece that I'm working on involves making a sci-fi wheel for a vehicle. I've researched a bunch of different ways of doing this, and quite honestly they all had the same issue. They weren't precise, relying on the bend modifier and closing the gap with merge, or they involved lots of fiddly poly modelling before, again relying on the curves modifier. With all that said, I think this is a better way using booleans and the data transfer modifier. It also uses the cutting the cutter technique from my advanced booleans video, so if you haven't seen that, give that a go after this. To begin with, we're going to add in a cylinder. We're going to change the vertices to 64. Give it 90 degrees on the Y rotation, and I found that 0.39 and 0.26 work for quite a nice proportions for a chunky looking tyre. Next we're going to shade auto smooth, and then lastly apply it all to remove the rotation. Next we're going to go into edit mode and bevel the sides. I'm using 6 segments. I want to keep quite a wide thick part in the middle that's being in contact with the ground, and I'm then just going to use proportional editing to scale in the sides, excluding the x-axis with Shift X, just to change the profile slightly. You can see the auto smooth popping on and off in some areas. I want it to stay on obviously, but I do need to shrink it in towards the middle a little bit. Next I'm going to inset, and then a second inset, bridge the faces, and then I'm just going to scale on the x-axis. Again, not enough that it breaks the auto smooth. The idea here is I want to create a flat part on the side of the wheel, but I want it to kind of round up to it. Just going to pull those bits out slightly. Next, on the inner edges, we're going to run a 4-segment bevel. This is the part of the wheel that sort of curves in towards the wheel barrel, where when I get to it I'll be modelling myself a cool sci-fi looking wheel hub to sit in the middle. But for now I'm just concentrating on the outer part, the tyre and the treads. So the 2 loops either side of the flat part and one slightly more towards the centre are the ones I'm going to mark as sharp. That keeps some curvature there while making it look quite cool on the sides. You want some bend on the front to allow for the treads. Going to make a duplicate to serve as a backup and also later the low poly. And now we're going to select this portion at the front, convert it to faces and grow it once, Control I to invert, and then delete the rest of the mesh. Next we're going to make a duplicate just of that segment, because we're going to use that later for the data transfer for the smoothing. So this section we're now going to use to make a detail for the treads, and we're going to use a Boolean to do that. I find that it's best to leave one edge loop between the sharp edge and the bit you're going to cut away with the Boolean. So I've just duplicated and separated this piece, and then I'm going to bevel that middle edge, change it to faces, invert and delete. Over in the modifier tab I'm going to add a solidify modifier, change the offset to 0, and then just check how far inside that goes. Might need to give it a little bit more. Okay, once that's done you can apply the solidify modifier and start editing the shape that you want to cut away for the treads. So I'm just going to add these cuts in here and scale them on the x-axis. And then I'm just going to move this portion down. With these end bits that go off round the edge of the tyre, they usually sort of taper away into nothingness. So I find the best way to do this is to collapse the edges on either side. So just M to merge, and then just use the collapse option to collapse those edges. And then with this edge, you can change the transform coordinates to normal. Change the transform coordinates to normal, and then just you can move it on the local Y or Z just to get it inside that line. You still want it to come to a point, ideally. It sort of depends how far inside it will cut in. With that, I'm just going to use double G for edge slide, just to make that triangle section longer on the edge there. And again, this is the cutter that we're going to be using, so this is what's going to basically make the tread. Next I want to bevel some of the sharper corners on this. But first what I might do is raise the whole thing up so it's slightly more central. So I'm just going to move that up on the z-axis. And the same with these loops, just a very slight, just to bring back the auto smooth. Next we're going to select those edges and bevel them. Using 4 segments is enough for enough rounding here. Just remove that center edge, we don't need that. If you make any changes to one side, just don't forget to mirror it over with bisect, but you can remove that center edge. Next we're going to shade auto smooth on the cutter and then run a difference brush boolean on the main object. This allows us to basically make any changes if we're not liking the way it looks. And we're also going to use a second cutter to bring back part of the mesh. Okay, so just going to add in a cube and scale it into place. This can be our second cutter. So when it's thin on the x-axis, going to rotate it 45 degrees on the y. Might need to rotate it again in a moment. Just make sure it's big enough to actually cut through the previous cutter. I want it to kind of go through that section at a 45 degree angle, or 90 degree angle, sorry. Scale that into place, going to apply all the rotation and then mirror it over, then apply the mirror just so it's equal on both sides, check that it goes through the other cutter, and again just run a brush difference Boolean. Next we can select the main object and apply all the brushes, and then remove any leftover colours. You'll see the shading is absolutely horrific, which is why we're going to use a data transfer later. But before we do that, we're just going to fix up some of the topology, some of the extra vertices that have been created. You'll see there's some that are just completely redundant, like that one, just in the middle of an edge. The trick here is not to move any of the verts that are for the silhouette. So anything that was part of the original cylinder, the original tyre, don't merge and move those ones, merge the inner ones that are for the where the tread's going. Hope that made sense. So you're merging the verts that are part of the tread, merge those to the outer part rather than the other way around. Some of these things you can join them up, some of them they're not worth joining up. And again, just once you've fixed most of them, just mirror them over with bisect and apply the mirror. Okay, next we need to make the vertex group. So just go in face select mode, shortest path select half of it, use mirror with extend, and then just grow the selection and invert. And then we're going to deselect the back portion. Go into object properties and add a vertex group, and just assign those selected faces to that group. Next we're going to add in the data transfer modifier. Click on the source and select the duplicate we made of this section. Put a check in face corner data, expand it and select custom normals, and then in the drop down projected face interpolated. This fixes up the shading and we can apply the modifier and remove the vertex group. Next, in object mode, we can press Shift D, RX 22.5 and enter to duplicate it, and then use Shift R to repeat those last actions until we have a complete circle again. Then we're going to select everything, press Ctrl J to join, and then merge all the verts. To see our results better, we can split the view, change one view to rendered and the other to a shader editor, add a material and set up an ambient occlusion through a color ramp and then through a mix RGB set to multiplier with the factor at 1. You've probably seen me set this material up a few times. Okay, once we're happy with that, we can crunch the color ramp to make it darker and adjust the color in slot 2 to adjust the base color. Next we're going to add in a bevel shader. This is so that the normals catch better when we bake a low poly from it. Just crank the samples up to the maximum and then just fine tune the radius. Doesn't need to be big, like a 0.2 or 0.3, 0.02 or 0.03 works pretty well in this case. At this point you can go straight to making the low poly, which is easily done as we made a copy of the profiled tyre earlier. We can select alternate loops to remove or use checker deselect on the rings. This technique also works with other tyres. If you start with a 32 vert cylinder, you can rotate the segments by 45 rather than 22.5 when you come to duplicate it radially. And additionally, as we have a backup of the full wheel and the pre-detailed segment, we can easily go back and make entirely different looking treads and make a whole new tyre very quickly. And that's it. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please give me a subscribe. Thank you for watching and take care.